Just to get the ball rolling, I wanted to start with a question that it kind of is on everyone's mind. So last week, President Biden signed into law one of the most sweeping national security pieces of legislation in recent history. It provides aid to Ukraine to stand up to Putin, and it stems the flow of deadly fentanyl into the country. And much to my chagrin, it mandates that TikTok owner Dance Byte either divest or sell in 9 months, just because, I find TikTok annoying. Just kidding. There's a lot of tech people in the room. So there's a lot to unpack with this piece of legislation. First, can we talk about the political dynamics on these issues and why it's important for us to be showing leadership on a global stage? And second, can you talk a little bit more about the real TikTok threats and kind of how that came together, uniting both chambers of Congress?
Great. Well, there's a lot in that question, and it's great through the lights to see many folks in the room I'm friends with, and again to both you and Dimitri, thank you for inviting me. I don't think I could have. The sausage making on the Hill is always a little strange. I remember when I was a kid in college, I was working for then Congressman Chris Dodd, and then he became a senator, and I obviously was on the banking committee with him, and I always remember Chris saying to me, Mark, you can never really predict when there's going to be moments in the Congress where stuff happens. I could have not predicted what happened in the last 10 days. We go literally for months and do squat, and then all of a sudden, at least in terms of my portfolio, we passed, FISA 702, which was critically important in terms of national security. And for those who said, oh my gosh, we can have it expire, it doesn't really make any difference. Baloney. There literally were 3 major telcos who had said if we'd gone into allowing the Section 702 to expire, they would stop working with the government, and it would have made us blind in certain areas. And I know beef with the telcos because they need that protection to make sure, again, that we can get access to foreigners abroad who pose a national security risk. And then, as you mentioned, we got the package done with TikTok, Ukraine, Israel, humanitarian aid, China, fentanyl. And I think it was extraordinarily important. And remember, on those pieces of legislation, we had, at the end of the day, 80% of the House and 80% of the Senate. You don't have 80% of the members of Congress that agree the sun rises in the east, let alone to do this major legislation. And let me take them in not order of importance, but Ukraine was the one that I've been the most critically concerned about. If we had failed to stand up for Ukraine, I think rightfully no other country would ever trust us again. And one of the things that I think we did a poor job on as advocates was how incredibly effective the Ukrainians have been. I'm an old guy. I grew up my whole life thinking our defense establishment was geared for potential conflict with the Soviet Union / Russia. The Ukrainians have taken on Russia, and with less than 3% of our military spend for 2 years, the Russian forces, the Ukrainian forces with great leadership, literally destroyed 87% of Russia's pre-existing ground forces, 63% of their tanks, 32% of armored personnel carriers, without the loss of a single American soldier or NATO soldier. That was incredible fortitude. And if we had not stepped up, it would have been the great unraveling. And I think it should have happened sooner. I wish the speaker would have brought it sooner, but at the end of the day, the speaker found a way to get it done. So I think that's critically important. I think, obviously, the challenge in Israel-Gaza is enormous. There will be military, but there's also billions of humanitarian aid, and God willing, Bill Burns, who's in region right now, I'm hoping and praying that he comes back with a hostage deal that will lead to a ceasefire. But we needed to step up there, and there was component parts on China and Taiwan that didn't get as much attention, but even had broader-based support in terms of how we deal long-term with the China threat. On TikTok, I've been at this for more than a year. Over a year ago, I had an approach that I thought was actually slightly better, because it said rather than taking TikTok or Kaspersky from Russia or Huawei as one-offs. We need a framework for foreign-based technology coming to America from nation states that we don't make up as adversaries, that are already written into law as adversarial: China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Cuba. And it was kind of it was a wild process a year ago, because we had so much bipartisan momentum, and the Biden administration supported us, and then TikTok/ByteDance dropped estimates of close to $100 million, some on lobbying, but a lot on basically supporting, I think, every political tip sheet in the morning. They sponsored it for weeks on end, and you couldn't turn on, traditional television without seeing a TikTok ad. And it was somewhat, since we're not on Chatham House rules, I'll be a little more discreet. And we had this, far left and far right combined together. Where a year later, and the divestiture plan is now signed into law. And I think it was a critical national security issue. There was no one from law enforcement, no one from the intel community that didn't say this was a problem. And if we'd step back, if there wasn't a TikTok, and we were going to offer a proposition that said, should we allow a Chinese communist-controlled company to come and get the attention of 170 million Americans for 90 minutes a day and scrape data, and at the same time also have a more powerful propaganda tool than Fox News and MSNBC combined? I think most of us would say, no way we'd let that happen. But that is what happened, and I know particularly our friends in the press and others said, well, declassify more. I'm still trying to push declassify more. But the fact that when the House Energy and Commerce Committee got the security brief and voted 50-0, and that's a pretty broad group on the House committee in terms of ideological spectrum, to take this on, I think it's important. Now, I do think it's closer to a year we've got to do this. I know a number of groups that are hoping to be potential bidders. One thing that, and I say this with, again, some trepidation, because I had a lot of friends in private equity, but I think it was remarkable going back to 2017, when then Richard Burr, chairman of the Intel Committee, we started all these classified roadshows were briefs by industry sector after industry sector about the challenges from China. And it was a huge wake-up call. Let me be clear, China's a great nation. My beef is with the CCP, with Xi Jinping. It is not with the Chinese people or the Chinese diaspora anywhere in the world, and it's so important to state that, because candidly, every time we don't state that, on WeChat and elsewhere, the Chinese leadership will say, hey, this is just all anti-China, anti-Asian. It is not. But when we did all those classified briefs, the one part of our economy that would not even take the brief pre-COVID was private equity. Now, that changed afterwards, because I think both the intellectual property theft and the way China has operated, and in the aftermath of the Ukraine invasion. And I make this kind of sideways, but because I do think 40% of ByteDance is controlled by American private equity. I think, and I know many of these entities, and again, like many of them, but I think we need to question them as well. What are you going to do now? Are you going to help us make sure there's a transition or a transaction so that the people who like the creativity or the social influencers who make their living off of this platform? I think that's all great, but I do think those American partners in ByteDance ought to help us remove the national security threat while maintaining the creativity that exists on the platform.
Excellent, thank you. I think you make a really wonderful point there, Senator, in that it is very, very difficult for free societies to cope with threats that come in very shiny packages, whether that is a TikTok video or it's the ability to make money in private equity off of these investments. And it is very hard to do the right thing for national security, and it's hard to stay the course on technological innovation, which is some of the themes of our conference this week as we pull the world back from the brink. I do have to say, I want to give you and Congress compliments, because I don't think you get complimented enough.
Stop the presses.
From the CHIPS Act to IRA to this recent national security measure, the U.S. has really been coming up with some really good policies. We've asked some questions this week about whether we are keeping pace and whether we're missing. And so I'd love to get your read, on our progress and what we need to do here forward.
Well, I could wax the whole rest of the time on that question, but I'll try to.
You can if you want. It's your show.
We have never faced a challenge like China. Russia, Soviet Union, was a military threat and an ideological threat. And again, China is a great nation, and they have been so remarkable over the last 50 years of how far they've moved forward. Now, again, if part of your foreign policy is stealing $500 billion a year of intellectual property theft from everyone else in the world, that helps you a little bit. And if you've got an authoritarian regime that can do industrial policy on steroids, that can help or hurt. And to kind of see how we're competing and staying up, if we were having this conversation a year ago, there was a real question, with who would win the AI race. I remember a very smart guy I got to know, Kai-Fu Lee, who wrote the book a couple years ago about AI, saying, who has the most data, who has the most compute, who can throw the most engineers would win. And under that premise, a year ago, I think there was a real open question about whether China or others would win in the AI race. I think a year later, it is clear that America is still head and shoulders above everyone else in the world and above China. And there are other pockets of AI excellence in France, and I think the Emiratis are doing some fascinating things. But our kind of innovation economy has been successful. Part of my job, I think, right now, is to help redefine national security as not simply tanks and guns and ships and planes. This started as for those of you who don't know me, my background was in the wireless industry, and there was a holy heck moment a number of years back when I'm looking at my industry and saying, we don't even have a major player anymore in terms of wireless infrastructure. Huawei was running the table, and who wins the 5G or next iteration ORAN? Competition is incredibly challenging. So my job on the Intel committee, and that led to the efforts vis-a-vis Huawei. It led as well. John Cornyn and I were the co-authors of the CHIPS bill to say the semiconductor industry, we need to actually put some money behind that, because if it was a pure free market play, I'm all for that, but there was not a pure free market play. China was investing billions, and I think we may need to do the same kind of investment strategy, and we are doing some of this already, in quantum computing, in critical minerals. I am a huge advocate as we think about all the power needs of these enormous data centers that AI will power on small modular nukes, SMRs, because solar and wind alone is not going to cut it. I've been spending a ton of time recently in the biospace. That is an area, biomanufacturing, and the kind of combining AI tools with scraping all the DNA sequences out there, and AI may be the unleashing in bio that has been overpromised and underdelivered for 20 years. And in that space, China is, with BGI and others, are quietly building up a capacity that we haven't met yet. But I do think these other technology domains, we're going to need to invest. The good news is, coming from the Intelligence Committee, we're still, I would argue, the last functioning bipartisan committee. And because there's not a technology committee in the Senate, we've kind of tried to grab that as a default. We're working with the other committees as well. But I do think we're going to need to continue to innovate, continue to make investments, and that will require USG to play a role in that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, and most of all because you filled one of my very important squares in my personal bingo card, which is talking about small nuclear reactors. And I agree wholeheartedly, we need to stop saying no new nukes and start saying get to know new nukes. It was a nuclear.
And frankly, because China and Russia are literally trying to sign up other nation states for 50 to 100-year contracts. And as we've seen, if you control a country's energy supplies, regardless, they're not going to be able to kind of move elsewhere. And I think as we try to pitch this as well to other nation states, they say, well, okay, if this is so great, America, why aren't you using SMRs? And there are about a half dozen in the country that are in a various stage of process. I think we've got some very active times where we are pushing some of the utilities who are obviously conservative, but push them into this domain. I think two things that I'm focused on right now on SMRs are, and I'm not picking Gen 3 versus Gen 4 and which are the exact technology. Smarter people than I should do that. But the two things that I hope will push us over the edge to move from potential to actually operational, and I do think the NRC, from the regulatory standpoint, is making some changes as well. But to kind of make this viable, one, we need DoD to send demand signals that they would take some of the offtake. But two, and there may be, I'm sure, folks from these entities in the room, we need big tech to step up as well. If you're going to have these incredibly consuming data centers, and Lord knows we've got a ton of them in Virginia, it's time for you guys to step up as well, to be part of the solution. And whether that is offtake agreements or actually even capital investment, because we've got that first-of-kind risk, and the government with the IRA has done a lot, but there still is a piece of risk there that I hope the hyperscalers, and we're pretty far down the path with a number of them, will be part of the solution on SMRs.
Awesome. You touched on three really important categories, which have been the theme of this conference, which is emergent technologies that we lead in, like AI and quantum, as well as the need for an underpinning infrastructure in the form of critical minerals, energy, to advance our economy. How are you thinking in terms of this matrix of guardrails for new technologies to manage their risks and peril in society, and how we enable our private sector to stay a cut above of our competition?
Well, let me add one more piece of that, and this has been something we've been working on for a few years, is how we get the intelligence community to actually think about, as we gather information and analyze, the intelligence community ought to not simply be looking at our adversaries' military prowess and governmental prowess. We need to be looking at these technology developments, and that's not been the job of traditional spies. But I think it's absolutely critical that when China signs various deals on critical minerals in Africa, or making transport connections, or kind of doing the processing where they own, even without the extraction, they have 80-90% of the processing capabilities. That to me has to be part of the national security gambit in terms of what the IC helps us analyze, number one. Number two, in terms of, and I should have mentioned this on TikTok, I hope that TikTok will also break the dam on Congress actually doing something other than talking about trying to put some guardrails on social media. I think it's crazy that we don't have a privacy law. I think it's crazy that we, certain low-hanging fruit like data portability and interoperability should have already been put in place on social media. I think it's way past time to have a fulsome debate on Section 230 reform. But we'll see what happens even real time right now with the FAA bill, whether the kids' online safety. We should have done that years ago. So we have this moment, and that's and as we then morph over to the AI domain, what I don't want, and I say this, let me say I've spent a ton of time on AI from in terms of politicians. I think I probably spent about the most time, and let me also quickly acknowledge that there's no linear relationship between me spending time on AI and actually getting smarter. And so I keep trying to learn as much as I can, but it is the whole economic premises around it I think, radically transformed in the last year. But what I don't buy from my friends in AI is, oh gosh, we're all for guardrails, but don't really do anything because that's going to slow innovation. If we make the same mistake that we made with social media and say, you guys go break things and create these enormous enterprises with no guardrails, and then we'll try to fix it 10 or 15 years later with AI, it would be a huge disaster. now. And I'm, still trying to sort through where the sweet spot is. I'm not hugely optimistic. I've got a lot of bipartisan legislation that would, implement the NIST standards, try to move some of the EOs from just EOs to stronger areas. We had at the Munich Security Conference, we got 20 of all the worldwide tech companies, AI and social media, to kind of say AI in elections this year, not just in America, but across the world. They are going to lean in on a voluntary agreement to do watermarking, to be willing to kind of have that be more transparent, to help educate and take down. Well, we had a great press conference in Munich, and we're now less than 60 days away from the European elections and 6 months away from the American elections, and I'm not sure any of those companies have really done anything meaningful in terms of that, just the transparency in AI in elections. I thought I had a great idea a couple months back, and I guess it's not been that great because we've not been able to fully implement it, which was, where are a couple of AI domains right now, you don't have to wait for the next generation, that could have enormous negative impact with AI tools. One is interference in elections, deep fakes, et cetera, but also market manipulation. I'm amazed that we've not seen more, not just of deep fakes of CEOs that could lead to stock manipulation, but the ability to create false product claims or false SEC filings, the litany of things that you could do in terms of market manipulation. And if I was a bad guy, I wouldn't go after a Fortune 100 company, but a Fortune 200 to 500 company. I was with a similar group of colleagues or tech folks at this cyber conference last night, and I think I wouldn't be surprised at all if in the next few months we discover there has been market manipulation using AI tools. But somehow I kept thinking if we get the big C capitalists with the small D Democrats together, we might be able to put some guardrails around AI, at least in those two domains. And I think that's still an open question.
It's fascinating. This has been an emergent theme also over the past couple of days, is this intersection between the new world and the old world. And what I mean by that is that the problems are the same, even though they're moving faster. So we still have recurrent issues around what I would summarize as trust, transparency, and verification. And that's true for the election domain. It's true for the supply chain domain. It's true for the AI and emergent technologies domain. So I know you've done quite a bit of work thinking about how the intelligence community can work with U.S. companies to counter this type of interaction, and in particular within critical mineral supply chains and also in other areas. I know you were quite a bit on AI, which you more than adequately just covered. What does that look like to you, and how do you think that is going to that can work?
How do we
marry the IC with U.S. businesses to make our supply chains more secure and enhance those three attributes of trust, transparency, and verification?
Well, I think we're still trying to figure that out. I think there has been a change. Remember, it wasn't all that many years ago when you had engineers at Google say, we don't even want to work on something like Maven. I think the world has changed fairly dramatically, and I think that's good. In terms of people who want to invest in national security, particularly under the broader array, if you accept my definition of what national security ought to be, it's all of these technology domains. I think I'm still trying to struggle on how we get the capital stack right. I'm a huge fan of In-Q-Tel. I think they do a great job, but relatively small entity, and I think the kind of rebranded and recapitalized DIUX has got potential on how you get people through that kind of valley of death as a former VC, from the startup stage. I'm looking at whether we ought to create some level of a debt vehicle as well that could help, but those would be governmental entities. I welcome suggestions or ideas from this group, which is, how do we create amongst funders from early stage to growth to later stage, funders that coalition of the willing? And that's, I think, where there could be that intersection between the IC and this coalition of the willing on funders. Do we do this in a formal structure? I've hosted a bunch of capital stack dinners. They take a lot of time. I'm not sure I've got all that much output, but do we have some kind of notation of trusted partners on the funding side. I know DOD's trying a little bit, but I think this is an area that it needs a lot more work. And the UK has actually done it even through kind of a formal trade association of funders that want to help on security and UK national defense. But this is an area that I'd love to explore more. And part of that, if you're a funder and I want you to make money. I was a VC. I want to make money, but I do think there are things where you can also help our national interests, and how we do that in a way that doesn't become overly bureaucratic or cumbersome is kind of something I think we're still searching for.
Yeah, I think it's a real challenge. And so one of the things we've raised here and have kind of come up again and again on this stage is that, especially in finance, but also in innovation, there needs to be premiums for these values. And we don't know how to build that into a system. So premiums in terms of national security, companies should do better because they care about national security. Premiums in terms of decarbonization, climate, and the environment, they should do better because they care about decarbonization. Companies should be able to do better because they want to work with friends and allies and not maximize their capital with adversaries. So, I mean, do you have, just off the top, any sort of thoughts on how we create and leverage those premiums?
Yeah, I'm still working on that. Is that public affirmation from policymakers? Is it sometimes calling out players with old-fashioned name and shame who don't or undermine our national security? I'm wrestling with this right now, vis-a-vis some of the things on the like on ByteDance. How do you have those partners who are already in the entity actually let them make a lot of money, but also let's help protect our national security and transition. And again, it doesn't have to be an American company. It could be a Brazilian company. It could be a French company. It just ought to not be something that's, I believe, at the end of the day, controlled by the CCP. And I also think there's such an opportunity for this country to actually partner with friends and allies around the world. China has clients, but they don't have allies. We, with all our flaws, still have allies. And some of this starts, frankly, with even changing some of just the way our language. I think every time we talk about the challenge from China or Russia or authoritarian nations, and we start with saying, well, America and the West or America and NATO, we piss off 2/3 of the world. I mean, there are many of our nation states across Asia that would much rather partner with us, across Africa, where a lot of the growth is going to come, across South America, where I'm showing myself, but it might have been the nomenclature of the communist world versus the free world when I was growing up. At least they didn't put geography around. So how we talk about potential alliances around the world, I think, is important. I think there's also a huge opportunity, particularly in some of the developing world, where the bloom is off the rose on China's Belt and Road Initiative. So many nations thought they were going to get this infrastructure, that we're going to create thousands of jobs in their country with good infrastructure, and the debt that China was offering seemed too good to be true. Well, in many of those countries, China brought their own workers. The infrastructure is pretty crappy, and the debt deals they're in make us look good by comparison. So again, a huge opportunity here. And I think one of the things we got to sort through, and I know I'm maybe getting a little off topic here, is I think China is facing this demographic challenge combined with an economy that has put all of their excess value, for the most part, into real estate, and that market is enormously kind of overburdened in China. And I think the Chinese leadership are basically, rather than saying, well, we need to restructure, they're going to go ahead and put pedal to the metal in terms of continuing to build an export economy that has no relationship to actually kind of dollars and cents in any kind of market base. So I think countries, I think about when I tried to make the pitch to some of our German friends in business pre-COVID, the first time it was kind of about China, they kind of shook their heads. Post-COVID, there was a little more understanding. But if China starts dumping $11,000 to $15,000 EVs into the European market, and they are losing money on each of those EVs because even 100% tariff may not make German cars competitive. You're going to see a lot more willingness to say how we sort this through. And again, I'm not for fulsome decoupling, but I do think we need to go in with eyes wide open. And as a former telecom guy, we had an interesting discussion yesterday about where does that lead in Asia to handset manufacturing. I think a lot of that can happen in India and Malaysia and Indonesia. I think it's why we're, I don't want to go fully down the rabbit hole on 5G versus O-RAN, but one of the reasons why we've been pushing Open Radio Access Network as the next generation wireless is because that pushes it from kind of hardware where Huawei has the advantage, and Ericsson, Nokia, and Samsung are good, but none of them are American. They actually don't have the scale that Huawei has, unfortunately. But if we can push it to O-RAN, where software suddenly open up a whole lot of additional American, European, and other entities that can compete. So I think, I'm not sure that answers the question, but it was a couple more points I wanted to make.
No, that was great, because it actually led it really succinctly into my next question, which is that, as we've seen this repeated pattern, as the U.S. has tried to either recover or start to get a foothold on particularly our industrial national security, whether it's clean energy technologies or critical minerals, the CCP has demonstrated a willingness to either throttle the tap in order to suppress prices and destroy markets, or to turn the tap off completely to let us know and give us a wink that they can, and that we are completely dependent on them. You rightly point to the fact that the one way that, and this has come up in our conversations here as well, one way that we can counter a market is with a bigger market of countries that are like-minded. What do those agreements look like to you? What do those relationships look like to you? Because I agree with you. It's not economic NATO necessarily, and you do need partners from all over the world, and not necessarily in any particular geography. So, kind of, how do we build that new alliance for this next century?
A great question. And one, let me again preface my answer with, I'm a capitalist. I think you take a risk, getting a reward is great. And I've generally been not supportive of what would be viewed as classic industrial policy. But when our largest competitor is playing with a totally different set of rules and can bring their scale to an industrial policy where they basically, some of the stories where they have their own nation state subsidized, pay more for their Huawei equipment, and then they can give it away to other nation states. I mean, that's not a fair competition. When China was basically sweeping up a lot of the semiconductor industry, a lot of that we let ourselves go to Taiwan to start with, and I do think one of the things of getting the CHIPS bill right and making sure it is spent out appropriately is really, I think Gina Raimondo and her team's doing a good job. But if we screw that up, the chances for doing other like-kind investments in other domains is going to dramatically diminish. To the question of how we build the alliances, I think we're going to have to, on critical minerals, make alliances with the nation states that have those minerals. But we also are going to have to find partners around the world where we can do processing, because without the processing, where you extract the minerals, there's only a piece of the pie. And that will mean, I think we've got great possibilities of that with Canada, with Australia, with other friends around the world. But it also means, to a certain degree, and this goes to SMRs, to critical mineral processing, to frankly how we do the CHIPS plan, we got to build stuff again in America. And that means we got to have a regulatory regime that doesn't slow down the building process 2 to 5 years more than even our competitors in the West. I mean, countries like Australia and Canada have got, if it's a project of national significance, they make sure the regulatory regime has to be completed, that whole process, in a year. And that doesn't mean they sacrifice huge amounts on the environment and elsewhere. And I do think there is a growing recognition, and I say this as a proud Democrat, that the Democrats ought to be for regulatory reform if we're going to be able to kind of have the economic growth here and around the world that we'd like to see.
Well, maybe you could call it regulatory effectiveness reform or something.
Good. Hey, we can use a new. No, I think we will rue the day, and and my friend Joe Manchin, when we didn't take the deal on what was your term?
Regulatory effectiveness reform.
That was put
Make
forward
it more
about
effective.
a year ago. So.
Yeah. No, but I think it is true that is kind of what we're talking about. So I work on the intersection of trade and climate and energy. I do a little bit on critical minerals. I lose a lot of sleep about these things. One thing I don't lose sleep over is AI, and the reason why is I'm married to Dimitri, and so I told him to let me know when I need to stop sleeping so well about AI, because I can only worry about so many of the horribles in the world, which is just a segue into, I'd love to wrap up for the last couple of minutes here, what is making you lose sleep at night, and what is making you sleep well?
Well, great softball final question. One of the things, listen, I'm sleeping a little better after 7:02, Ukraine, TikTok and stuff. But I do, and Jen is here in the front row, and I commend what Jen has been doing at CISA stuff. But I am, in many ways, more worried about foreign intervention in our elections today than I was 4 years ago. And I got 4 reasons why.
Jen's got it.
Pardon me? Well, I hope we've had lots of conversation about this, but there are hosts of reasons why I'm concerned about this. One, amongst some of my friends that I work with, there's a complete kind of rewriting of what happened in 2016, that somehow this was benign, it was a few bots. No, this was an organized plan by a foreign nation state to dramatically interfere in our elections with misinformation, disinformation, some level of cyber attacks, literally to the point where if they'd been a little more successful, they were pitting Americans against Americans that would commit physical violence. One of the things that came out of the 2016 investigation, all bipartisan, was the Russian efforts to have kind of a fake group in Texas that was very right-wing, kind of Texas secessionists, and a group in Texas that were, Texas Muslims that were trying to protect Muslims from discrimination. They created an event in Houston where Americans showed up, and but for intervention, we would have had violence. So the idea that this was somehow some benign activity doesn't make sense, number one. Number two, 2016 was pretty much Russia. 2024, our adversaries, and frankly not even full adversaries, know it's a lot easier to interfere in our elections than it is to spend money on tanks and submarines and guns. So we've got more potential adversaries out there. Number three, I'm going to go through 5 reasons. Americans believe a lot more conspiracy theories today than they did in the past. Part of that is because parts of our political leadership, frankly, feed on those conspiracy theories and things that are just, no connection to reality, and that's, and that happens on a lot of the social media platforms. So we've got that happening. Number 4 is, and this was not, something that Jen could say grace over. It was more DOJ legal opinion for a while, but the case, was it Murphy versus Missouri? Fifth Circuit case that basically tried to say that the United States government should not even have voluntary communications with the social media companies. Back in 2020, because of what happened in 2016, and this was under the Trump administration, and whether it was Chris Krebs or Paul Nakasone or Chris Way, there was a free flow of information between the platforms and USG. So if we saw things that were bad actions coming from a foreign nation state, and this is only about foreign nation state interference, we could rapidly share that. I think we went for 6 months with no communication at all because I think the lawyers were a little overwrought. That's better, but that muscle memory has to be rebuilt a little bit, and we're in the midst of the election season. And then, and this goes to your question about what whether you should start worrying about AI. We do have AI tools now that can bring speed and scale with disinformation at an exponentially higher level. So, we got enough differences between us as Americans. We ought to fight that out amongst ourselves. So and not have foreign interference. And so that's one of the things that keeps me up. What gives me more hope, and I'm going to take more than my 7 seconds left,
You have all the time you want,
is
Senator.
just the fact that if we, the glass half full or half empty debate, and there is this kind of unease, kind of overwrought funkiness that I think we feel, and I'm not sure it's just in America, I think it's around the world, but if you step back and just say, okay, how are we doing on any kind of objective basis? Well, if you look around the world, who came out of COVID better than the United States? I'm not sure any nation did. We're still, obviously, inflation is still too high, but we're wrestling with that, and I do think the Fed is, it's not been as easy as we may have hoped 4 or 5 months ago in terms of bringing down, but I still think we're on a pretty good path to a relative soft landing. Not many other nation states can claim that. We've had record job growth, 48, 49 months in a row. We got stock markets of every indice at a record high. We've got issues like, again, just a year ago, we would have thought, no, who's going to win the first level of the AI battle? Will it be China? No one would deny that America is not further ahead than any other nation state in the world, in particular our competitors like China. I remember I'm very pro-India. I'm long India. I've been trying to wrestle with our friends in India for some time to get off the moral ambiguity about Russia and Ukraine. And a senior Indian official said to me, Mark, I don't know any Indian that wants to immigrate to China or Russia. And yes, the border is a mess, but part of the reason the border is a mess is because people will actually put their lives in jeopardy to have a little taste of what we take for granted every day. And we should celebrate that secret sauce. One of the things that really concerns me is if we lose that secret sauce. We are the only nation in the world, and Dimitri, you are a living example of this, where you can come first generation and you are as American as anybody in the room. I mean, I could move to France tomorrow. I'm never going to be French. So there are so many things that are, that are positive here. And I don't want to be Pollyannish. I think the threats are real, and Lord knows it takes us too long, a la Ukraine. But at the end of the day, betting against this country actually doing the right thing is never been a good bet. And I was, whenever I made that comment in the past, and this will be my last, I will stop talking after this. I always used to cite the supposed Churchill quote that said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And it always gets a little bit of that response, but it was a really disturbing to me about 6 months ago. Maybe it was through, I don't think it was through ChatGPT, but somebody kind of said, Churchill never said that. But that notion that America is going to do the right thing, whoever said it, was right. It sometimes takes us too long. But as evidence of the last 10 or 12 days, we do ultimately get it right. So I do think there are a lot of things that we ought to celebrate in this country. And my final appeal, so much for like Senator saying I'm going to stop talking. My ask of all of you, I don't care where you fall on the political spectrum, the only thing that could really undermine that still forward-leaning, optimistic view is vote for people, particularly in Congress, that know how to get to yes. As somebody who's been a business guy, I think I've finally, I think I may have actually crossed over and been in politics longer than business, but if I'd run a business where all I did was run down my competition and never put out a good product, I wouldn't be in business very long. And too many of the men and women I work with, they can tell you absolutely what they're against, but they have no legislative record at all. And the truth is, Congress is never going to get it 100% right the first time. That's why things need to be bipartisan, so both sides can own when you have to come back and fix things. So get people who know how to get to yes in positions of leadership where they're willing to meet somebody halfway, and this country's going to do fine.
I agree.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Senator.